Welcome, listeners, to a realm where shadows dance and whispers echo. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this is Quills and Chills, the podcast that brings you face to face with the masterminds behind the macabre. In each episode, we journey into the minds of horror writers and filmmakers to uncover the secrets lurking within their tales of terror. From classic tales to modern nightmares, we'll traverse the corridors of the human psyche and unravel the threads of dread that keep us turning the pages or sitting out there in the dark. Welcome to Quills and Chills. Hello and welcome back. I am your host, Rick Clifton, and today's guest, Paul Vidich, is the acclaimed author of several espionage thrillers, including Beirut Station, which was selected by Crime Reads as one of the best espionage novels of 2023. A former media executive, he's now turned novelist, and he is here today to talk to me about his latest novel, The Poet's Game, A Spy in Moscow. So welcome to the show, Paul.
Well, thank you for having me, Rick. I appreciate being here for you and your audience.
I love a good thriller, and this book was really one of those that was just impossible for me to put down. And I gotta say, I had this question. I feel like you live in this really interesting, sort of fascinating space, right, between both duty and conscience. And for me, that was something that really kind of stood out, especially in this story. When you're writing, how do you keep a story grounded when you're working with characters who are constantly navigating lies? They're navigating loyalty, right? Their allegiances are always shifting. Like, how do you keep grounded with your characters in that regard?
And that's a great question. I think we all live in a world of seeming and being, in everything we do in our lives. We have a front we present to our family, to our friends. But in the case of the spies world, seeming and believing are very important. And it's often the case that the spy professionally lies for his business or her business and deceives on behalf of some higher order of things, some national security interest. And that's one of the things that drew me to the world of spies in the beginning. It's how you operate at two levels in your life. You have your family you go back to, but then you go off into the world and you're, in certain situations, suborning friends or people who you think of you as a friend, or you may be doing things that are uncomfortable morally, but which are part of the job. And those are the things that I think are interesting as characters because they set up a conflict between who you are and what you're required to do. So those are things that I think are important in all literature, but in spy fiction, you get to play with those issues in wonderful ways and entertaining ways.
That's right, on a much bigger scale too. So that's interesting to me. I'm just curious. You said in the beginning, do you feel like you're more drawn to the mechanics of espionage, or do you think it's more the emotional cost or the emotional things that are at play, or the emotional toll maybe that it takes on the people?
Well, I think you need a plot to establish the arc of a story, sort of the thing that is required of your spy. But ultimately, I think the thing that is interesting is how the individual deals with those responsibilities, that duty, as you put it. And how does duty conflict with, your moral sensibility about the world? So in my case, it's almost always the situation that there is a request moment where the spy is told that they have to do something, or the spy agrees to do something. And then from then on, what you find is that the character's reaction to that request and the character's reaction to the situation in which he or her finds himself takes over. And the many twists and turns are a function of the interplay between the events they find, the situation they find themselves in, and how they react to those situations.
Well, let's talk about Alex Matthews and how he reacts, shall we? Tell us a little bit about what the Poets game, A Spy in Moscow, is all about.
So I'll try to be a little brief, but the story begins in 2018, and if many of your listeners will recall, it was a pretty fraught time. There had been an election in 2016. There had been, thoughts that there had been election interference. And in 2018, at the start of the novel, the director of Central Intelligence receives word from a long dormant Russian asset that this asset had compromised on the American president. And the question the director had to ask himself was, do I ignore it? Do I go to the White House and say, by the way, look what we have found? Or does he decide to pursue it on his own? And in this case, the director pursues it on his own and reaches out to Alex Matthews, who had been in the agency, but now is an investor in Moscow. And he had been the one who originally recruited this Russian asset, who has been dormant for 10 years. So because he's now an investor in Russia, he's sort of working non-official cover. And he's able to go to Moscow, connect with this asset. And in their first meeting, they discover that the meeting is disrupted by the presence of FSB agents. And upon his return to Washington, there's a sort of a determination that there must have been a compromise somewhere in Washington, that somebody in the agency or somebody in the White House or somebody associated with this activity had compromised the event. So now what you've got is two threads going forward. Alex has to go back to Moscow to bring out this, exfiltrate this asset, and he has to do it in such a way that he doesn't himself become the victim of this compromise. But having said that, that's sort of the arc of the story, of the plot. But what the story, in my view, is really about is trust. Trust between a spy and his handler, and a trust in marriage. And these two things are in many ways quite similar. The asset and the handler trust each other in a very complicated situation, particularly because the asset is putting himself or herself in the hands of the enemy. And when there is doubt and suspicion, that can create all sorts of problems in that relationship. The same is true in marriage. A husband and wife are intimate, but when somebody suspects there's infidelity in the marriage, then the trust, the intimacy, all the little shared secrets begin to fray. And the difference is that in the case of a marriage, when trust is gone and suspicion takes over, you sort of, it can be very unfortunate, and it also can be very humorous. But in the case of an asset and his handler, when trust is gone, the results can be fatal.
Indeed. Let's dive into Alex a little bit. I find him to be or Matthews, I think is how we refer to him mostly through the story, but I find him to be a very fascinating protagonist, haunted by some personal loss, maybe even a little bit of disillusionment, but yet still at the end of the day, very committed to his work. And I wonder if you could talk about crafting that character a little bit. What specific traits did you feel made him both effective, but yet also vulnerable?
Well, I wanted to give him a backstory with his family that put him in a position where he had things at stake, some personal things at stake. And in his case, he had, as we all do with jobs, and I worked in corporate America, there are enormous demands placed on you. And sometimes, and often, those demands interfere with your family life. And so in this case, Alex Matthews had committed to his job as a spy, which required a lot of foreign travel. And that ended up having creating a conflict with his wife and his daughter. And the result of his making a choice to go overseas and leave his wife behind, and the result of that is the wife dies in a boating accident, left him with a lot of guilt. And that guilt becomes one of the things that he deals with. And because the FSB agent that he becomes close to understands his guilt, the FSB exploit it. And they take advantage of it, knowing that that's his vulnerability. And so what you discover is that when these agents are really smart, what they do is they understand everything about the person that they've targeted. And then they exploit those vulnerabilities in a way that is sort of unknown to the person who's the target. And that ends up being one of the overarching character themes in Alex Matthews' life. And it obviously implicates how the plot of the story takes off as well. So I wanted to, what I try to do with my characters is to create three-dimensional characters who have a history, who, aren't just driven by, a situation, but bring to the story, full lives, rich lives. And it's in fact those character traits that define how the story unfolds. I mean, it's. I think it was F. Scott Fitzgerald who said, character is plot, and plot is character. And I think that the best novels in our genre are those in which you remember who the characters are. You don't really remember the plot in most books, but if you have a really strong character, then that's what you remember. Carré Smiley, we all remember, we have an image of who Smiley is. He's a guy who isn't upper crust. He's got a wife who's, has lovers, and he's a little overweight, and everything he does is intellectually reasoning with the situation he's found. But I remember that about him, and I can't really tell you what the plot of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is. It's very complex and very convoluted, but we remember the character, and I think character is the essence of all good fiction.
Well, to that end, I am wondering, of all the characters in this book, do you have a favorite one that maybe it surprised you or it lingered in your mind after you're finished? And before you answer that, I'm going to say the one I think I fell in love with was Codename Byron. I don't think it's a spoiler to say his name, but I'll go by his code name, which was Byron. But for me, he was such an unforgettable presence from the moment he showed up on the scene, and the way his story just kept evolving and twisting all the way to the end. I was just a big fan of that. And I'm just wondering if you had a favorite one that stood out to you. And I know that's like asking a parent to pick their favorite child, but still.
Right. Well, no, thank you. I appreciate that choice. And actually, I probably would have chosen Grigoriev, who's Byron, as well, because he's a very complicated person. He's always trying to catch an angle. But he's also in some ways, a very sort of kind and generous person. But he's got all of these flaws. He's a deeply flawed character. And I think the flaws make him interesting in the end. And he's just sort of rough around the edges, and a Russian to boot. So he doesn't believe in, the system he's a part of, which makes him very much an outsider and a dissident. And I think those qualities make him appealing and sympathetic in the end.
I really loved how you crafted his backstory, his struggles with his father growing up, his wife, their journey together. I know we didn't get too into the details of their journey, but it was it worked for me on a lot of levels. So he was just really a very unforgettable character for me. So another thing, one of the most compelling threads, I think, in the Poets game is this I touched on a little bit in the beginning, this ever-present tension that just kind of leapt off the page from the very first chapter. And it just kept going. And I found it very, I love a story where I never want to put it down because I need to know what's going to happen next. And I felt like it was this with every single chapter. I'm like, okay, I'll do one more chapter. And I'm like, well, okay, I'm going to do one more chapter. Okay, I'm going to do it. And it just became one more. And it was really possible to put down. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of building that thread and sort of like how you build upon those moments.
Yeah, I think there's always conflict is probably the thing that draws a reader onto the page more than anything else. If you go into a bar and you have two people talking to each other, agreeing with each other, it's not very interesting. But if you go into a bar and you hear an argument, you're immediately drawn to what's being said and, what's the source of this argument. And I think in creating characters and scenes and situations, it's the same sort of thing. You want to evoke a sense of suspense and tension, sort of in some ways to destabilize the world that the reader is in. And that I think draws the reader into the situation. So that's the goal. And the question becomes, how do you do it? And in my case, I'm very much scene driven. The first scene has to establish characters and it has to create this unstable situation where there is a meeting that's been blown. And then from there, you follow that thread. And there always has to be, as I said before, this request moment. Something is being requested of the main character. And then in many of the scenes going forward, what you discover is that there are many people who are standing in the way of that character doing what he's supposed to do. And then all of these uncertainties emerge. And that to me is the most interesting sort of novel to read. But it's not just in this sort of genre. I mean, you think about The Great Gatsby. It's the same thing. You're introduced to this character in the early pages, but you actually don't see him on page until about page 40 out of a 180-page book. So when people are talking about this person, you become curious about who they are. So when finally Gatsby appears on the stage, you say, oh, this is interesting. And in your mind, you're contrasting the character who's on stage to the character who's been previously described. So all of this is a way of sort of maintaining tension, maintaining interest. And ultimately, there's a question that is posed to the reader that the author is trying to solve for. And it could be a murder mystery, or it could be, in this case, what happens with this character as he tries to exfiltrate a Russian asset. Where's the leak coming from in Washington? But when you do it with deeply formed characters, you're really living the story through the character's eyes. You're not really just feeling like these are pawns being pushed around by an omnipresent author who's sort of, using whatever, tropes and tactics you have, but you're really feeling it within the characters of the character. It's from the character. And that's what makes, I think, great fiction.
I think you did it very well. I felt very organic to me in the obstacles and the developments and the way they came up. And one thing that I just sort of thought about that struck me as I was reading is you talk about Matthews leaning into his fear when he's in these situations. And it's something I never really thought about, actually, when you're watching like spy movies and thrillers or even in reading a lot of novels. The characters don't talk about the fear that they're feeling about what like makes them alert and drives them through the scene. And I thought that was a very interesting angle, as far as his psyche and sort of him being in that moment and being scared and letting that fear make him more alert. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think what we do our best work when we're when we're frightened
Exactly.
of failing, and that's Matthews, and it's interesting because he had been in that world of spying at the CIA, covert officer, and then he leaves that world to go off into banking. And there's a line in the book that there was nothing that he had ever done in banking that felt as meaningful or as real as what he had done as a spy, which is why he, accepts the request to go back and operate under non-official cover.
I want to talk a little bit about Moscow. Now, I read your acknowledgments page, and I know that you acknowledge quite a few people for helping you sort of understand Moscow and the inner workings of all of that. But I'm wondering, have you been to Moscow, and did you walk these streets that Matthews was on, and what kind of research sort of went into sort of being able to authentically depict the city's atmosphere?
I have not been to Moscow, although it's a city I like to go to. Unfortunately, it's not someplace you can go to now. So what I've done when I haven't been to a place is I do 3 levels of research. The first is to read memoirs of people who've lived in Moscow in a sort of circumstance not unlike the circumstance of my characters' lives. So memoirs of spies, of businessmen, journalists, and they will give you a very particular view of Moscow, the view of somebody who's there as a foreigner, who's subject to surveillance, and who understands how to move around Moscow as an outsider. The next level of research is really to see the city from the point of view of the streets. And you can do that now with Google Street View. You can actually get there, walk down the streets, you can see the color of the windows, you can see, the color of the dome on, the Russian Orthodox Church. And it allows you to really participate at a level without sort of all of the noise that comes from being in a city. And the next thing is as I create my characters, I see the city through their eyes. So I'm not trying to create an illustrator's view of Moscow. I'm not trying to describe things, in a way that you would if you were reading a travel magazine or a travel website. What I'm doing is seeing the city through the character. And that means when he goes down the street, he's looking left or right to see if he's being surveilled. Or in the case of Matthews, he's also seeing the city as this place that has drawn him. The history has drawn him. He's interested in the poetry and the statues. And so I make the scenes, I bring into the scenes some of these elements that fascinate him. So I create a city through the eyes of the character. And that makes it come alive, even if I haven't been there. It's alive for him and hopefully for the reader.
Very much alive. And I will say, as far as Google Street View, I will admit I did that. There were places that you called out in the story, and I was like, let me Google this real quick. I need to see what this bridge looks like. I need to see what these stairs look like. And it made me very interested in seeking out sort of visuals to sort of immerse myself into that story a little.
So 2 things that have been very satisfying for me is that 2 of the people who have read the book afterwards, one of them, John Barely, who was the first American ambassador to the Russian Federation, and another guy named Ken Dekleva, who was in the State Department stationed in Moscow for 5 years. They both read the book. And in the case of John Barely, he had read it in an early draft, and he made a number of very important observations about my descriptions of the city. But in each case, they had lived there, so they knew the city and what they were drawn, and they liked, and they felt that the book represented the Moscow that they knew, partly because the Moscow I'm presenting is one where there's always this tension in the background. There's this sense of intrigue and danger. And as Americans working there, they felt that intrigue, they felt that danger, they felt the dark presence of surveillance wherever they went. And so, and that's really what you try and accomplish. You're trying to accomplish that sort of sensibility. But I think it's true of all writers. All writers will, it could be you write into the future or you write into the deep past. And in a time and perhaps even a place where you, the writer, have never been. But to be able to pull that off successfully is really the magic trick that the writer plays, the sleight of hand of the writer's craft.
I thought it was crafted really well. And to that point, I want to talk about your process a little bit. I read somewhere that you actually write your first drafts in longhand form. Do you still do that? Is it still part of your process?
It is. I've done it. And I've used the same pen. All 7 books with one pen.
So what does writing by hand give you creatively that a keyboard? I mean, I feel like I know the answer to this question, honestly. But I mean, if you could talk a little bit about what it gives you creatively that you don't necessarily get through a keyboard.
Well, it started off that I had to write by hand because I was writing in the sort of margins of my life, early in the morning when the kids were asleep and, at lunch hours at work. But what I discovered over time is that when you write and you have, your hand on the pen and you're putting the word on the page, there's sort of a tactile relationship between you and the page. The sort of, you can feel the word coming out of your brain and making its appearance on the page. And when I type, which I do at the end as I put everything into a final manuscript, it's very quick. And the question is, you can actually type faster than you can think in some respects, whereas the act of writing by hand is a slower process, a more deliberate process, and it allows me to sort of, in some ways, take the thoughts that I'm trying to express and put them on the page in a very careful way, whereas writing can be very, strung out. And when I edit my writing on the typewriter, I invariably find that there are a sentence of 20 words, you can cut out 5 of them. And that's another reason why my books are relatively short in this genre. My books are generally somewhere between 65 and this book is the longest, 80,000 words. But a lot of books in the genre are 100,000 words or 120,000 words. And I try and be much more efficient in the telling of the story. And I think part of it comes from the fact that I write these longhand and only type them in at a much later stage.
So now that makes me beg the question, if you're writing in a notebook, what does your notebook look like? Does it have a lot of I don't want to write that. Let me change this. And a little strike throughs and scribbles. Because mine was.
All of that. Well, but so I tend to write start to finish. I'll start the novel and I'll write the first draft somewhere between 45 and 60 days. And then I will start the second draft and start all over, writing every word again. Again, it takes 45 to 60 days. And then the third draft, the same, and the fourth draft. And what I discover as I rewrite these things is I learn more about what I want to say as I'm rewriting what I have said. And I think it deepens the characters. It allows me to, in some ways, open up the gaps of the stuff that isn't on the page that allows the reader to really fill in. And then Hemingway is the one who said, the book only represents the tip of the iceberg. Everything that you need to know about these characters and the story is really not in the book. It is it's there because the reader has to sort of discover for themselves all this background. And so in some ways, what I like to say is that a book isn't complete until the reader has finished it doing the job of the author, which is sort of to create a world that lives beyond the page. And in rewriting that, allows me to discover those silences, those gaps, and the things that the imagination of the reader has to complete.
It's fun. It's great, and I love that you handwrite these. It's made me fall in love with you, I got to say. So, my favorite question to always ask is there a favorite moment for you in this story that you look forward to readers discovering? And before you answer that, I actually do have one, and this one comes really at the end, so it is a spoiler, so I'm going to be very coded about it, but I think you'll know what I mean when I say it. But it's a moment that happens between Alex and his current wife, Anna, and it's very near the end of the story, and it's her comment about David. And for me, I thought that was just such a really great, special moment, and I didn't expect that to come, and I was kind of really moved by that. So
that is so nice of you to say. I spent a lot of time thinking about that moment, that very precise moment, given the circumstances between the two of them, and I decided that this actually gives you an insight into Anna and into Anna's relationship in a way that is a little unexpected. So it's nice to hear. I mean, for me, I'm not sure that there is a moment, but I would say that the moments that I enjoy are the moments where characters surprise each other. And there are a number of those in the book, things that we didn't expect something. I mean, one of the situations, I guess, that I enjoyed was it's somewhere toward the beginning of the novel when Matthews has come back to Moscow and he is being confronted by the FSB. He gets in this SUV, and lo and behold, the driver
yes.
of the FSB is agent, who is both picking him up and also at the same time hiding. And it's like that's a wonderful way to introduce. The question is, how do you introduce characters?
That's another great moment. You're right. So I think it's one of the things that made me fall in love with that character. It was such a great moment. So
yeah, I mean, here's a guy who's like, this is the most stupid thing to do, but at the same time, it's like completely consistent with the crazy,
yes,
adventurousness of his character,
It is great. It is also probably one of, and all the near misses, I think, too, like him being able to dodge surveillance and things. Those are the things that excite me about these stories. So, but yes, that moment that you described is also really great. So I was like, what? I loved it. It's fantastic. So I'm just kind of curious. Your novels often delve deep into the world of espionage, so it makes me wonder, this is kind of a lighthearted question, if you could have dinner with any fictional spy from literature or film, who would it be and why?
Oh, fictional spy. I guess I'd like to, I'll name a couple because they'd each sort of be somewhat different. Than one of them is a guy named Paul Christopher. He is the principal character in the books written by this guy, McCary, who was in the CIA and then left and Charles McCary became a very well-known writer of espionage and probably one of the first Americans. And this guy, Paul Christopher, is a very smart, interesting, sardonic character. And he'd be interesting to sort of, and you always feel, that sort of the several layers of identity in him. So it would be interesting to sort of have a conversation with him. I think, obviously the Smiley character would be interesting.
Yes.
To some extent, I can imagine a conversation with Smiley being really a conversation with John le Carré himself, because in some ways you sort of see his character as an alter ego of the author. And, le Carré was a very intelligent, sophisticated, well-spoken individual. And again, with all these characters, it's sort of being in their presence to listen to the way that they describe the world and try and read into their thinking at the same time, because that they're not telling you the whole truth. What they're doing is trying to, to some extent, charm you with a story. But then you have to see beyond the story and really to understand what's really on their mind. So so those would be fun. Those would be fun conversations.
I think for me, I'm going to go with Jason Bourne, just because I think there's something very interesting about talking to a much later, much older version of him, looking back over his life and not knowing half of it, right? And not having uncovered half of that. So I find that would be a very interesting conversation. But a much older, like in his 80s, Jason Bourne is who I'd like to
Right.
So Paul, what can readers look forward to? Are there more stories coming with Matthews? Any other new characters that you're working on that you can share with us?
Sure. Well, this book, most of my books are standalone books, but in this case, with Alex Matthews, there's a follow-up, which is right now in the hands of my agent. And I will probably make it a trilogy, because I'm really interested in the character, but as much as I'm interested in the character, I'm very interested in the current geopolitical landscape. So this book, The Poet's Game, is set in 2018. The next one is set in 2020, in the fall run-up to the 2020 election. And it deals with compromise and election interference. It's mostly set in Washington, D.C., and then the third one that's coming after that is going to be set probably in 2022 or 2023. And the thing that I really always appreciated about Alan First and Eric Ambler before him, particularly Ambler, is he set many of his best novels in the 1930s, the later 1930s. And he really tried to find a way through his novels and his characters to bring to life the things that he saw in his world. And that was the rise of Nazism, the rise of nationalism, and the threats that they posed to the democracies in the 1930s. And so I think as a writer, we do have a responsibility to live in the world and to sort of our characters certainly have views about the world they're in. And so these 2-3 books that I'm in the midst of right now I do take on that responsibility but in a way where it's really about the characters, but they live in a world that, we're living in, actually.
I did love how you sort of touched on current events for the timeline, but you didn't really get into specifics or whatever. I thought it was really great, and I'm very, very excited that you're going to be exploring more of Matthews' world. So I'm excited to see more of Alex Matthews and what's to come. So the book is called The Poet's Game, A Spy in Moscow. It's available everywhere now. It was out as of May 6th. And as we always like to say here, please go and support your local bookstore whenever possible. So
I agree. Support your local bookstore. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And I do hope you'll come back when there's more Alex Matthews to talk. Well, anytime. You're more than welcome back anytime. I'll say it that way. So.
I look forward to it.
All right, you guys, we'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Thanks for joining me on another episode of Quills and Chills. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mysterious and the haunted. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to support us by subscribing on your preferred podcast platform and leaving us a rating or review. because your feedback helps keep those chills running down both our spines. And feel free to share the show with your favorite fellow horror enthusiasts. Also, if you guys have any spooky stories, strange encounters, or paranormal experiences of your own, I'd love to hear them. Reach out to me on social media or email me at quillsandchillspodcast@gmail.com. Who knows? Your story might end up on a very special episode. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, y'all.